I hope this a little bit amplifies my usually quiet voice. My name is Nataliia Popovych. I'm chairperson of the Great House in Denmark, and it's a great privilege to welcome you on a very symbolic date of May 9th to this discussion at Ukraine House, where we decided this year to focus on covering and reflecting on different liberation experiences after World War II by representatives of different nations, from the perspective of Ukrainians, of Crimean Tatars, of Danes living in Bornholm, of many other European nations that I think until today are very much rediscovering, the history of the 20th century and are reevaluating the World War II and its outcomes and the lessons from it that are still very relevant for today. This event is in partnership and with support of the European Commission in Denmark, and it's my great pleasure to offer the word of welcome to Peter.
Thank you very much. Just a few words from me. First of all, happy 9th of May. Today is the Day of Europe. It's the Day of Democracy, and it's the day where we celebrate liberation and the start of what we know as the European Union. So we are very honored to be here in this house. I can think of no better place to celebrate 9th of May than in this house, because democracy is not a sort of historical relic. It's a living thing, and it entails rights that we should never take for granted, especially during these days. I want to thank, of course, Ukraine and all Ukrainians for reminding us in Europe what we have and also who we are. So this is very powerful. It's a very moving moment for us in the EU to stand side by side by Ukraine. Our Ukrainian heroes, they fight every day. They give their lives every day to achieve, democratic values, rights, all of which are things that we in Europe take as granted as the air we breathe. But it's a staunch reminder that this can be taken away at any moment. So this is a very solemn and very important moment for us, and we are very happy to be part of this event. So thank you very much to all of you for coming. Thank you to all of you to celebrate Europe Day. And let me end by saying long live Europe and Slava Ukraine.
Right. So, as Peter said, today's conversation takes place on May 9th, a date that for long has carried very different interpretations in different countries of the world, including until 2015 for Ukrainians themselves, because it's only in 2015 that Ukraine decided to change, first of all, the wording from what was used to be this traditional Russian historiography of calling it Great Patriotic War to World War II. And Ukraine, for the first time in 2015, on May 8th, celebrated or marked together with all of the European nations the first hour of peace. And then May 9th was reserved to obviously mark and be celebrated as the day of Europe. And I think it was extremely important, choice because in Europe there is obviously different points of view, but there is a consensus that World War II should be a warning, that aggression should not be awarded, and then that borders must not be changed by force, and that totalitarian violence must be named, and peace must be protected through accountability. But for Moscow, and we have in Ukraine researched how the Russian media and Russian historiography continued to talk about World War II in all of the last years, and it's been continuous, this false glorification of state power, of military sacrifice, putting, kind of relating to people as statistics, imperial continuity, and other things. It's also only in 2015 that Ukraine kind of challenged the slogan that all Europeans probably know really well, never again. Unfortunately for us, 2014 already marked the irrelevance of that slogan, because never again happened for us when Russia annexed Crimea and started war in the east of Ukraine. So I'm a little bit proud that I at the time served in the Ukraine Crisis Media Center in Kyiv, and we worked alongside the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory at the time, and we developed this new, I think, slogan that is used until today in Ukraine: we remember and we prevail, because it seems that when we have the true understanding of history, when we find the truth and true lessons of the World War II, only then that memory becomes actually for us an immunity in our ability to prevail and ensure that lessons are learned. So I hope that today we're going to have a great discussion, because we are joined by amazing selection of experts, and I'm truly grateful to my colleagues Tatiana Chish and Yon, who prepared this meeting. So first and foremost, to have these different perspectives on World War II and especially on this angle of liberation. We have Spartacus Olsson with us, who is a Swedish historian, documentary producer, one of the most influential creators of public history projects on the First and Second World Wars. His work helped actually millions of viewers understand the nuances of the wars, of the atrocities of the interwar years, and the construction of historical memory. So I hope that today he will help us to place liberation in a broader European and international context, also given the fact that he was born in Sweden, or lives now in Sweden, but
No, I live in Germany.
You live in Germany, but was exactly also lived in France. So you have these different contexts also of how World War II is taught in schools, right, and is used in education, because it's so extremely important. Then also we have with us Gulnara Abdulayeva, who is joining us online. Gulnara is already here. She's a historian, a writer, and a journalist from Crimea. It's not the first time Gulnara is joining us, because we had once event dedicated to the history of Crimean Tatar. So Gulnara, welcome back. Gulnara is one of the leading voices on the history of Crimean Tatar people. Her work, I think, is extremely important to how we understand what liberation and overall how the liberation by the Soviets became deportation, dispossession, and put the nation of Crimean Tatars on the brink of survival. We're also going to be joined a little bit later, I understand, by Anton Drobovych. He'll also be joining us online, and Anton is a former director of he's a Ukrainian historian, and he's former director of the Institute of National Memory in Ukraine, and now he's a serviceman in the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and he's also now one of the leading scholars at the Kyiv School of Economics in the program, actually, that kind of re-reflects on different topics important for Ukrainian national memory. And Jakob Seerup, I'm extremely grateful that you were able to join us. You're a Danish historian and museum curator at Bornholm Museum. I have to say that when for the first time I realized that in Denmark you have this history of Russian occupation, which is so unusual, where I think so few people in the world realize that the island of Bornholm was occupied on 7th of May 1945, it's so contrary to everything that you would typically read in, again, like books of history of the whole post-Russian or post-Soviet space, you could say, that it comes as a huge surprise, but it's such a valuable and probably there are a lot of hard-won lessons from the history of Bornholm that are very important for Danish and Nordic history. So we very much look forward to understanding how and what has happened and what that has meant also for you. And then before we begin, I just wanted to say that today we have a very peculiar, we had a very peculiar end of yesterday and beginning of today, because I think Russia's May Day rituals, have made everybody very, very nervous in the last week, with a lot of nuclear blackmail coming from Kremlin, that if Ukraine does something, about the Russian parade, then there were these constant appeals by Russian propagandists like Solovyov and others that they're going to nuke Kiev. And then I think yesterday's presidential decree by President Zelensky allowing for the parade to take place in Moscow. I think is a really good, it's a really good kind of, to me, it's like a continuation of what from the painting of Ilya Repin, when the Zaporizhian Cossacks are writing the letter to Sultan. So to me, this is like a really nice 2026 continuation of the same tradition where Ukrainians are just kind of memeing what these fears and fear mongering that comes from Kremlin. But I mean, jokes aside, it's not a theater, and this whole situation obviously is deadly serious. So let's turn over to our discussion. So I think I would like to start with asking all of you to maybe define and help us define this term liberation, and how, from your experience and from your writing and from your research and how it has meant in your contexts, how would you define it? And maybe we could start with you.
Sure.
And you can have.
I can take that one, yeah. So I think liberation, first of all, it's not only a difference between East and West, it's really a difference between where you were regionally even, and who you were. The different identities were really significant. If you were somebody who was being liberated out of Nazi concentration camps or something like that, then it was pure liberation. And there we can also see the similarities between East and West, how the Soviet Union liberated the concentration camps equally humanitarian as the Western allies, and it was a question of taking care. But otherwise, it was a really big difference. I think there are two great examples of that. One is Ukraine, and the other one is France, where a very similar situation happened on liberation itself, on the very, very moment it was liberated, and that's Western Ukraine, which had been Poland partly until then 1939. Experienced a completely different kind of liberation than Eastern Ukraine, where it was already Soviet Union before the war, and things turned out very. That's one aspect of it. That was a change of control, and a change from maybe to the worse from before the war, at least. Now compared to the Nazis, anything is better than the Nazis when it comes to 1940s. But in France, you have another interesting aspect of it, and that is that you have a southern part of the country where you have the kind of image of liberation that we have maybe in our minds, with parades and people being happy and dancing in the streets. And you have the northern part of France, which is completely bombed to pieces, and where the liberators are not exactly welcomed as somebody who's liberating the country, but somebody who's just been killing me. And where it's very, very different. So and this goes, I mean, we have Porno as an example. Everywhere, it's not a national thing, it's a regional thing, and it's an individual thing. Who were you? Did you collaborate? Did you not collaborate? Were you a victim? Were you not a victim? This is really, really important to remember. And I think that the most important part, therefore, when we look at it from a national historiographical viewpoint, is not the liberation itself, but the memory of liberation. How did we form a memory? We were talking about this just before we started now. As a child, when I grew up in France, all of France was the La Résistance. There were 45 million members of the resistance. As a historian, we know that number is not at all true. It ended with 500,000, and until a few months before the war, it was only barely over 100,000. So and that changed in the 1990s. And I think then, tying back into the European Union and the 9th of May as we are today, I think that is the work that we have ahead of us, that we have started, but that we have ahead of us, and that you have started in Ukraine, which is so important, and that is trying to come back to an epistemologically sound memory of the war that is taught in schools. Because, you said never again, and that's been the slogan for so many years. That's how I grew up with it, was never again. I end my shows with never forget, specifically because you can't guarantee that it's not going to happen again. And by the time you're about to stop it from never happening again, then it's already too late. We have to make sure that the structures don't arise that enable the war. And unfortunately, we failed you. We failed you in the 90s, and we failed you in the early 2000s. We especially failed you in 2014. And I can only hope that we continue on the path that we have set out now, and try to avoid that the war on Ukraine becomes yet another memory that is distorted to the point of where we don't remember what is really at play here. And what is at play is what you were talking about. It is democracy, it is safety, it is human rights. That is what we're talking about. We're not talking about some kind of national honor or anything like that. We're talking about what each and every one of us depend on in order to have our lives in the way that we should be able to. And,
Thank you, Spartacus, for this opening. And true, there are probably even regional differences, like you say, and this preservation and understanding of the nuances that are then being left in the memory is extremely important. Anton, maybe we could turn over to you for like a brief introductory comment into this topic as we are discussing what liberation has meant to different parts in Ukraine, to different parts of Ukrainian population after World War II. I already mentioned while you were joining that it's in 2015 that Ukraine changed actually of kind of celebrating or marking from Great Patriotic War to World War II, and from slogan "Never Again" to "We Remember, We Prevail." So the memory is central here, and you do you do so much through the courses that you teach and through your work with the KSC's program now and your previous work in the Institute of Memory. So what's your take on it?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for your invitation. About liberation word, I have only short remark because this Soviet practice and a lot of cases in Ukraine, in Europe, shows that what is Soviet pseudo-liberation is. For many European countries, it wasn't a liberation, but a change of scenery in a totalitarian theater. For example, the Nazi play was simply replaced by a communist one. And in short, it was a totalitarian rebranding. That's all. That's not liberation. In our case, for example, when we're talking about these days, for example, yesterday we have Day of Remembrance, Remembrance and Victory. In Russia, they have only Victory Day with some toxic nuances. And in our optic, we don't use this term liberation. We replace Nazi, yes, and Nazi gone. This is our optic. In our context, for example, this optic, Day of Remembrance and Victory is very important to be together. Because remembrance of the price of war and its horrific sacrifice is very important part, and victory over the Nazi totalitarian regime is second part. Both components are essential, as the memory of victory over evil provides the strength and faith that such a feat is possible in the future. This is a power for resistance now, because victory against Nazi is very important part of our history. Meanwhile, remembrance serves as a safeguard against pride and excessive obsession with triumph, reminding us of the immense effort and blood of its cost. It's very important part. It's like a protection against Russia insane that they have, because only victory religion is very dangerous one. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton, for these starting comments. Gulnara, even before what we officially know as the end of World War II, in 1944, already kind of on the winning streak. for Crimean Tatars, it was not about liberation, it was about exile. If you could just bring us maybe a little bit into the context of what happened with the Crimean Tatar nation. You're on mute, so maybe
You're muted.
Thank you very much. Якщо можна, я буду українською, якщо можна перекладати трошки.
правильно. Так, звичайно, звичайно.
Так, ну дійсно, в першу чергу хочу сказати, що так, радянська влада звинуватила кримських татар на той час у тоталітарному колабораціонізмі, не тому що мала реальні докази вини всього народу, тому що їй було потрібно проста і зрозуміла пропагандистська формула для виправдовування масового злочину депортації 18 травня 1944 року.
So Gulnara is saying that first of all, the labeling of the entire Crimean Tatar people and accusing them of the collaborationism with the totalitarian regime was not because it had any evidence, but it was to find one very simple accusation that would justify the deportation of the entire nation.
Я тут нагадаю, що під час депортації перших років заслання загинуло понад 46,2% людей. І це був справжній геноцид кримсько-татарського народу.
So when the nation was deported in the first years of after the deportation, which happened actually on 18th of May 1944, 46.2% of the entire nation died. So it was the true genocide of the Crimean Tatar nation.
Само слово «тотальний» було ключовим. Воно дозволяло не розбиратися в долях конкретних людей, не говорити про людей, які були на фронті, підпільників, партизанів, жінок, дітей чи людей похилого віку. А коли цілий народ оголошується зрадником, тоді будь-яке насильство проти нього починає подаватися як необхідний захід безпеки в лапках.
So basically this total, the word total is critical here because this total labeling of the entire nation has enabled that there weren't nuances of different cases of people and their behavior, heroic during the war or undercover or women or children or the elderly, but it actually enabled just a blanket accusation and blanket deportation of the entire nation.
Це класичний механізм колективного покарання, який використовувався тоталітарним режимом ХХ століття.
And it was and I'm sorry, I did not translate from the previously what you said that when the entire nation is announced a traitor, then the highest this can justify any violence towards it. So this labeling by traitorship has justified this violence. Якщо ви можете повторити останні речі?
Це класичний механізм колективного покарання, який використовувався тоталітарним режимом ХХ століття.
The classical example of how the totalitarian regime was able to kind of use then this against the entire nation.
І саме тому цей міф так живучий у російському дискурсі навіть у 2026 році, тому що він досі виконує політичну функцію.
And that's why actually this myth of the traitorship still prevails in the current Russian propaganda and current Russian mythology, because it's so strong that it trespassed this entire time, and it's still used for political reasons.
Визнати, що депортація кримських татар була злочином і актом геноцидної політики, означало б для сучасної Росії поставити під сумнів не лише сталінську політику, а й саму імперську модель держави, яка будується на праві силою карати таких неблагодійні народи та території.
in order for Russians right now, for example, to recognize that it was a mistake and or recognize the genocidal character of its actions against the Crimean Tatars in the past is actually to question the very nature of kind of neo-imperial formation that the current, the current Russia is. So it's therefore impossible.
Російська державна історична політика багато в чому досі спирається на радянську спадщину, де держава апріорі не може бути злочином, а отже завжди повинна мати виправдання своїм репресіям.
And the current Russian regime, it is kind of a successor of this like Soviet, Soviet system where state is never at guilt, like state cannot be wrong in regards to its policies.
Саме тому десятиліттями в радянській, а потім російській історіографії навмисно перебільшували масштаби співпраці кримських татар із нацистами. І цифри ставали інструментом пропаганди.
And that's why for dozens and dozens of years in Russian history books and Russian historiography, the numbers, the falsified numbers of stating about the numbers of Crimean Tatars collaborating with the Nazi regime would be, constantly growing and re-emphasized.
А з'явилися абсурдні твердження про десятки тисяч убитих мирних жителів та військовополонених, нібито знищених кількома батальйонами по 200-300 осіб. Такі цифри не витримують жодної критики не з військової, не з демографічної точки зору.
So there are these absurd numbers where like two military formations were responsible for hundreds of thousands of victims, and those numbers cannot be challenged by neither military, political, or any other means, but still they prevail.
Тобто пропаганда завжди була таким емоційним тавруванням цілого народу та створювала образ внутрішнього ворога.
And this propaganda continued on, and it has prevailed in creating this image of an internal enemy within.
А при цьому радянська влада свідомо замовчувала інші факти. Те, що десятки тисяч кримських татар, воюючи у складі Червоної армії на фронтах Другої світової війни, а також дуже багато воювали, що серед кримських татар були герої на той час Радянського Союзу, і офіцери, генерали, льотчики, розвідники, тобто тисячі людей, кримських татар, які віддали своє життя якраз під час Другої світової війни.
At the same time, Russian historiography has erased the stories of those Crimean Tatars who were part of the Red Army, who were generals, colonels, pilots, and served, in different battles against the Nazi army. So their role has been reduced or erased in order to fit this label that it has come up with for the Crimean Tatars.
Що під час німецької окупації Криму якраз німці розстрілювали тисячі кримських татар, а за допомогою партизан спалювали кримсько-татарські села. То, що кримські татари допомагали партизанам, спалювали практично 104 села, було спалено під час німецької окупації. Тобто реальність була набагато складнішою та типовою для будь-якої окупованої території на той час СРСР. Де були і колабораціоністи, і герої, і жертви, і усі народі без винятку.
But reality, of course, was much more complex as any occupied territory history, which had its heroes and collaborators and stories of extermination of entire villages with the participation of collaborators. But the story is much more complex and nuanced as anywhere else. Дякую, Гульнара. Ми до вас повернемося, напевно, з багатьма уточнюючими ще запитаннями далі. А зараз послухаємо Якоба про Born Farm. Добре?
Добре.
I think now over to you, Jakob, because as I said, I think it's still very much I don't know to what extent known fact, maybe thanks to Spartacus's work and the important podcasts and kind of a public education work on history that is taking place in Europe right now, that people are learning more. But again, I think not enough people know that Bornholm was a part of Denmark's liberation in May 1945, but the island's experience was very, very different because Soviet aircraft bombed Rone and Nexo, right, on 7th and 8th of May. And Soviet troops remained on the island until early 1946. So what liberation is for you?
Well, it is indeed a different kind of liberation, and it is also a contested word, because in one respect, it is obviously correct that Bornholm was indeed liberated by the Soviet forces from the German troops who were there. And in effect, Bornholm became part of the Eastern Front during the last month or so of World War II, and that sort of necessitated, if not for any other reason than at least geographically, that Soviet troops would liberate this island. But the problem is that in Denmark we celebrate May 4th because the news of the surrender of the German forces in Denmark was broadcast from BBC in London on the night of May 4th. So that, of course, caused jubilation all over Denmark, also including on Bornholm. But the German commandant didn't want to surrender to Soviet troops because he had a good idea about maybe he wouldn't receive a very kind treatment from the Red Army. So
Foresight.
and also he wanted to hold on to Bornholm as a sort of a middle ground for escaping or retreating German troops that were retreating across the Baltic towards the western part of Germany in those last weeks of the war. So for that reason, Soviet planes bombed Nexø and Rønne. Miraculously, only 10 civilian Bornholmers died during those bombardments. But of course, the devastation was terrible, and it was indeed the two Danish cities that suffered the greatest devastations during World War II in Denmark. And now comes the definition problem here, because I would claim also today that the point must be that all of Denmark was indeed liberated on May 5th when the German surrender went into force, even if it was not respected by the local commandant. But the Soviet troops landed on Bornholm on May 9th, and the first thing they did was that they evacuated all German troops and civilian refugees from Bornholm. But then they remained on the island for the following 11 months, only to leave on April 5, 1946. And so you will now find a debate among some people: do we celebrate May 4th, or do we celebrate April 5? And it's quite a recent thing that people celebrate April 5. That wasn't the done thing in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, but now I think perhaps in the light of what we see today with Russia as a threat, I think Bornholmers have come to realize how incredibly lucky we were that the Soviet troops did leave on April 5, 1946. So, and I think that in itself is cause for celebration, but it's not. But it is sort of a different definition of what liberation is, then you've got the legacy of this, where you've got a Soviet cemetery on the island, where there is still a monument, where today our good friend Ambassador Barbin of the Russian Federation came and laid a wreath in honor of the war heroes. And many people ask me, why don't you remove that monument? And what's that? Does that have a legitimacy in light of what is going on in the world today? And I normally say to people, yes, well, one day each year, Ambassador Barbin uses it as a place of propaganda for Russia and his Putinist ideals. All the other days of the year, I use it to educate people about how Russia abuses its history. Because I've had thousands of people visiting that monument, and even the text on it is a lie. That these soldiers died fighting Germans. They did not. The first 9 who were there, who were buried there, died from alcohol poisoning, because they had gotten hold of something that they shouldn't have drunk. And the majority of the people who are buried there are victims of a troop transport that hit a mine. And why did it hit a mine? Well, because the Soviet authorities had failed to sweep the route of mines, thereby making it incredibly difficult for ships to sail there. And what we see today is that this is the place that the Russian Federation chooses in Denmark to sort of mark the victory day, I can see it's a problem, but I can also see that it is sort of laughable, and I think we sort of have a good place which is within walking distance from the Folkemøde, so everyone can go on a tour with me, and I can tell people about what really happened instead of the usual Russian propaganda.
Thank you for I think opening this up maybe for discussion, because like would everybody else agree, like you know, on your point, because I do trust that, you know, 364 other days you use it for a good cause of actually educating. But I mean, if there is not a plaque by that monument saying what actually happened, and people only have to refer to your services to help them explain the history, you know, is this enough? I wonder what Spartacus thinks in terms of because, you know, I just want to point out that what our famous and also I'm sure Anton has a point about it, because we have a huge debate in Ukraine. What should happen to all of the monuments of you know, totalitarian you know, past? And right now there is actually one really interesting project unfolding in Kyiv, which I hope Anton will talk a little bit. Where do we place them, and how do we redefine them so next generations can actually learn from it? But an interesting point about the cemetery, thank you for bringing this up. Oksana Zabushko, a famous Ukrainian writer, said that one of the conditions of Russian troops withdrawing from East Germany after the Berlin Wall fell down, and when there was the discussion of the reunification of Germany, was that all of the monuments to the Russian soldiers would stay, and they stay as markers of influence, domination on the territory. And whether that's good or bad, given the current German politics, maybe Spartacus can tell us the influence of that, what the actual influence of is of these, you know, points of memory.
Well, this is a huge topic.
I
This
know.
is a huge topic, because on one end we have we have individual trauma, we have individual tragedy that, of course, fades over time, but we're talking about people's parents, grandparents, sisters, brothers, and so on. So it's a difficult thing when we're talking about the dead. That's definitely very, very complicated. I'm going to leave that to the side for the moment. I'm going to focus on the monuments, which is, of course, the debate that's going on all over the world at the moment.
Yeah.
If we go to America, we're talking about what do we do with the Union heroes versus the Confederacy heroes. Are they the same value? People throwing Winston Churchill into the water in England because, well, he was the reason why Time Magazine didn't actually make him person of the century. They make him person of the half century because his views were too dated by 2000 to do that. So all of that is there. I have a very strong opinion here, and I agree with Jakob to a degree, but I also agree with you. We need to make sure that these things are put into a context which makes us able to learn from it. And I think we have to differentiate here a little bit about two different kinds of monuments. If we're talking about what was going on across the Soviet-dominated East before the end of the Cold War, or what was going on in Nazi Germany until 1945. We're talking about the celebration of a totalitarian regime by bombastic buildings, by huge statues that celebrate an autocrat or totalitarian regime. Those need to be taken down. I think that's just, it's the simple, that's what we did to Germany. And I say we, I mean the world. I don't mean the specific nation. We eradicated the Nazi monuments. Very many, if you look at Lithuania and Estonia and well, the Baltic states in total, they were, Latvia as well, they were taken down and they were destroyed. Now there is a park where all of the Stalin and Lenin statues are around and you can go see them. And they are put into context. And that's the really important part. You put it into context and put it where you go. However, where I think, and this is where I think it comes together, there is one place in Europe where I think this has been the most successful and is really beautiful, and that is Verdun after World War I. Verdun is a breathtaking example of how it needs to be done. It's a little simpler than when we're talking about totalitarian regimes because it's very hard to say who was at fault for what happened at Verdun. It was obviously French soil and the Germans were the invaders. There's no question. It's a very complex situation that happens there. But today, when you go there, you will find the European flag, the German flag, and the French flag, and the British flag flying next to each other. And every year, on November 11th, it is not one of these nations that come together, but it is the French and the Germans who host the British as well. And they come together and they remember the dead. They do, and they remember the tragedy. But the premise of that is that you have a shared historiography. If you do not have a shared historiography, that is not possible. And that is what we're facing right now. We're facing a difference where most of Europe has moved on. Parts of Europe have not moved on. If we're talking nationally, Russia has not moved on, that's clear. But we also have the situation within the other European countries. We have the situation within Ukraine. We have the situation within Germany. We have a new resurgence of remembrance, which is going in the wrong direction. And I don't say wrong direction politically, I say wrong direction factually. And that is, I think that is also the point. Why could Germany and France come together so beautifully at Verdun and start remembering the tragedy? Well, it's because they had gone away from the propagandistic distortion of history and they started looking at it from the tragic human perspective of what went on there, where the blame had stopped being the center of the thing and the heroic breasting yourself into we're the victors, and you talked about victory in the beginning as well, we're the victors and you're the losers. Well, that's not how humanity works. If that was the case, I wouldn't be allowed to sit here. We've done some really horrible things to this country. And for that matter, I mean, I'm talking about the Swedes now. And for that matter, the Danes weren't that nice to us either. And as a Swede, Wow, I gotta really, I should just, I should stay within my own country, because what we did between 1628 and 1648 was an absolute disaster. I mean, it's only topped by Hitler some 100 years later. Not even Napoleon came that far. So, you know, that, and we got to get away with that. Away from it, not away with it. We have to stop looking at it from a ideological perspective and start looking at it from a human perspective. And from a human perspective, I think we can all agree easily that communism was a tragedy. It was not anything else. We can talk about wrong or right ideology back and forth. People died, people suffered. And the same thing for Nazism, fascism, imperialism, colonialism. It's suffering, and we need to stop the suffering. And we got to remember the suffering, not those who inflicted the suffering.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. I will like to pass the floor now to Anton. Just fully agree, but how is this happening now, you know, in the Ukrainian context, where it's one thing, and things probably are easier in terms of remembrance when it is taking place amongst the nations who have agreed on how they assess the past. And in the case of those who have been perpetrators, where they're taking the, you know, the responsibility, and there is the redemption, there is the rewriting and explaining to the future generations of, you know, Germans in case of the Nazism, of what not to do in the future. But this has not happened in the Russian historiography, unfortunately. No lesson has been learned, and our research has shown 5-6 years ago, actually, Ukrainian Institute and my company, One Philosophy, we did this massive research of how the lessons of 20th century, including in particular of World War II, were showcased in the media of different countries, from United Kingdom, France, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. And basically, Ukraine and the rest of Europe were more or less in the same sense of understanding, you know, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In some countries, they didn't want to really talk about it, but, you know, there was sense of that it was bad, and Yalta Agreement wasn't grand for part of Europe. You know, there was some consensus, but in Russia, it was still all like, you know, we're innocent, we're just victors. And by the way, we won victory, we won the war almost without any help of these others, even though we know that Crimean Tatars were deported in the US trucks. Because there wouldn't have been this, you know, victory of the Red Army if it wasn't for the support of the Allies, obviously. But I mean, when memory is so distorted, Anton, how does remembrance taking place, you know, in Ukraine, and what we are doing now to make sure that we still remember the nuances as well?
I suppose we have only one way, only one good way. And this way is historical truth, or in other words, put some reality, put some stories in the real context of the what happened there, who was there, and this is only one way for normal, for real and honest understanding of this situation. Now in Ukraine, we try to organize this normal dialogue, normal conversation about the past, and find some good solution to explain what lessons we find after this. But for example, we have a conversation before this meeting about case of Yad Vashem in 2020, for example, and when Russia come to Israel and say, yeah, we are saviors, we are liberated Auschwitz, etc., and they try to change the narrative. And now we see that Nazi and communism is the same curse, different shape, but they use very real cases from history to change the short story and make another picture. And the most dangerous thing isn't even the narrative itself, but the favor of distinguish many people simply don't want to look into details. Gulnara mentioned about this. A lot of people don't understand these details, and that the USSR was never a force for good. At one point, they were betrayed by their Nazi ally and joined their enemies. They continued to commit numerous crimes, from mass rapes in Germany to the deportation of Crimean Tatars, Greeks, and Armenians from Crimea. Crimes for which neither the USSR nor Russia, which insist on being the heir of Soviet glory, has never ever been held accountable. This is a massive problem. And when Russia hides behind the title of liberator of Auschwitz, few people know that under the Soviet control, the camp continued to serve as a part of their own repressive system for some time. And this detail very important. When we took all these detail on the table and understand all context, we have chance. This is not guarantee. We have chance to normal understanding of process. We must connect all these details, and this is only one way. And in Ukraine, we try to do this in memory policy and in our education system, but without some strong directives, etc. We try to do it in the liberal way. Even now, even during the war, we try to fix this situation with a lot of lie and finds this a real inclusive history of past.
Thank you, Anton. And maybe Gulnara, coming back to you, because obviously for Crimean Tatars, what happened in 1944, and then the formation and the possibility for the nation to come back. But now again, you've mentioned in your interviews that obviously Crimean Tatars who live in Crimea, they observe and applaud to every single strike of the Ukrainian army, of what we call kinetic sanctions by Ukrainian army into the Russian Federation, because other sanctions somehow are too weak, so we have to do it or to amplify it ourselves. But at the same time, obviously, the life of every Crimean Tatar who wants to stay in the identity of Crimean Tatar in Crimea now is in danger. So walk us sort of through how that is viewed from your perspective.
Для кримських татар, дійсно, зараз слово визволення має дуже конкретний і глибокий особливий зміст. Це не абстрактне політичне поняття і не лише зміна прапора над адміністративними будівлями. Для нашого народу визволення означає повернення права жити на власній землі без страху, без переслідувань, без постійної загрози нових репресій.
So for Crimean Tatars, even today, obviously the word liberation would mean not only just the change of the flag of a new jurisdiction in Crimea, but ability to live without fear, without prejudice, without persecution, which still is relevant for Crimean Tatars.
Кримські татари вже пережили депортацію 44-го року, коли весь народ був насильно вивезений з батьківщини, і майже півстоліття ми боролися за право повернення додому.
So Crimean Tatar nation already lived through that, ill-famed deportation from 1944, and for 50 years afterward, throughout that deportation, it was fighting for its possibility to come back home. So coming back at home and living at home is the priority.
Після 14-го року історія багато в чому повторилася. Знову почалися арешти, обшуки, зникнення людей, політичне переслідування, заборона представницького органу кримських татар Меджлису, тиск на журналістів, активістів, релігійних громад. Тисячі людей знову були змушені залишити на той час Крим.
In 2014, basically for Crimean Tatars, the history of 1944 repeated, because it was the arrests, the searches in houses, persecutions, the eradication of the working of the representative organ of Crimean Tatars, which is Majlis. So the history, repeated itself again.
Тому в 26-му році визволення для кримських татар означає передусім припинення російської окупації та демонтаж системи страху, яка панує досі на півострові. Це означає звільнення політичних в'язнів, повернення незаконно ув'язнених додому, припинення репресій проти тих, хто зберігає свою ідентичність і відкрито говорить правду.
So in 2026, for Crimean Tatars, of course, liberation means the release of all people who are in captivity, the ability to live without these persecutions, the ability to live without fear, the ability to express themselves again, because there were persecutions of journalists and different groups. The ability to live in a Crimean Tatar identity, which they refused right now.
Але визволення має ширший зміст – це відновлення історичної справедливості.
But liberation also has a wider context, which is the renewal of historical accountability.
І коли в 22-му році в інтерв'ю я казала, що в Криму люди пили святкову каву після удару по російській авіабазі в Новофьодоровці, це була не радість через сам факт вибухів, це було відчуття надії. Уперше за довгий час люди побачили, що окупація не є вічністю, що Росія не всесильна і що повернення свободи є реальним.
And when Gulnara in August 2022, in an interview to Cape Independent, said that when Ukrainians struck the Novofedorivka air base in Crimea, and she back then said that her friends in Crimea were drinking celebratory coffee, to this, but for the time being, they couldn't do or say more than that. It wasn't just because of that strike. It was because what Ukrainians shown was a sense of hope, that this occupation is not omnipresent, that it's possible to challenge Russia, that it can end.
Саме це є справжнє значення слова «визволення» для кримських татар у 26-му році. Не помства, а повернення свободи, не руйнування, а відновлення справедливості. Не просто зміна влади, а можливість знову жити вдома у вільному, українському, кримсько-татарському Криму.
So for now, for 2026, for Crimean Tatars, the liberation would mean not again just a change of the governance, but the possibility to live in a democratic, free Crimea. And it's not about revenge; it's about accountability, and it's about the possibility to live in freedom and at home. I think it's all connected to obviously the still living memory, like in the case of Crimean Tatars, in case of Ukrainians, memories that are told through stories, through family histories. But kind of coming back to the point, there are still a lot of things probably in the past that different nations of Europe would call inconvenient past, things that they don't want to talk about, that there aren't enough of something in the historical context so that we could actually learn from history. Jakob, for the Danish history, do you believe that everything from the lessons that can be learned from Red Army occupation of Bornholm, of that year, that Bornholm people had to, endure in the neighborhood or in presence of the Red Army, that it's talked enough, understood enough, taught enough, in the context of Denmark?
Well, I think when I came to Bornholm's museum in 2018, it was still sort of a half-forgotten event in the past. That there had indeed been this Soviet occupation, but
was it a little bit like top down?
Well, it was. It's a funny thing how this works. Where the graveyard there, because I think for a while there in the 90s, it was seen as sort of a place where you could sort of meet the new good neighbors after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, and Russia was turning into something better, we hoped. But then with 2014, we stopped taking part in that the wreath laying thing there every year, and with the full-scale invasion in 2022, I think people started really focusing on this sort of Russian element in Bornholm's past, because the history is this mirror you hold up, like that. You see that now Russia is fighting this illegal war in Ukraine, and there's an aggressive neighbor here. Where have we seen them before? Have we met them before? Yes, we did that in 1945, 46, and so that's something in the present is making something in the past relevant, so to speak. And so we've seen lately a lot of focus on that Soviet occupation, and there's been carried out some research. I was the guy who came Russia celebrates its history like all other big organizations by making this huge online website, Pamyat Naroda. And there you can look up all the servicemen of the Red Army, and so you can look up and see when you see the names on those gravestones on Bornholm, you can look those names up and see how did they die. That's how we find out. Okay, that was an alcohol poisoning. They did not die in a hail of bullets in a battle on Bornholm, because there was no fighting on Bornholm when the Soviets came on May 9th. So we are exploring it much more thoroughly now. Other recent research has shown that there were 27 reported cases of rape, and they were very they were investigated like all other criminal cases by the local police, and but they had no jurisdiction over the Soviet soldiers. So the police would get all this evidence together. They would then give it to the governor, like a Danish state official, who is sort of the go-between between the Danish government and the Soviets. And he would then go to the Soviet general and say, we have these cases of rape. And General Yakushov was his name, said, these are just people who don't like communists. So they never prosecuted any of these cases. So I think we're learning more and more, and ironically, in many respects, because the Russians have put all the evidence online on Pamyat Naroda. So yes, I think it's it's a field that people find fascinating, and that I think we are learning from to this day.
I wanted to follow up. Yeah, I think it's in kind of almost a cultural thing about accountability without or crime without accountability instead of crime and accountability. But in terms of how does the story of Bornholm kind of, informs now, you feel, the Danish defense policy, the NATO defense policy, because obviously there was this case of not only Ambassador Barbin, but others kind of making the case that, since we withdrew, now Bornholm, could never be a place of the disposition of the Allied troops. What is the learning from that?
Oh, how long do we have? Because that's a long story.
I take questions from the audience too, but
no, but
like a summary on the.
But I'll try and give a brief summary. The thing is that in 1946, when the Soviets leave, there is an exchange of notes between the Danish government and the Soviet government, and in that note exchange, and this is just notes. It's not a treaty. It's not any like it. It is it is stipulated that if Danish troops could take over the protection of the islands without participation of foreign troops, i.e. Soviet troops, then Soviet was prepared to withdraw its troops. This was then sort of over-interpreted during the Cold War as it had said, as if it had said that there could never be any other foreign troops on Bornholm, which was not what the note said. But that was how the Danish government looked at it and how the Soviet government looked at it, because they were worried about the conflict level in the Baltic. Now, even in the 1990s, this policy was sort of still in place informally, we have recently found out. But at least since 2000, we've regularly had visits from foreign troops, including Russian troops, which makes it all the more hilarious when Ambassador Barbin says we cannot have foreign troops on Bornholm. I always have this wonderful photo of Russian troops flying a big Russian tricolor in Rønne, because of course there can be foreign troops on Bornholm if the Danish government invites them. It's the uninvited ones we're sort of worried about, and that's the problem. Because that's the problem now. Because the Danish government has been they have not put a foot wrong in regards to the support to Ukraine, and it makes me proud as a Dane that we've really followed up on our words and supported in all the ways that we have. However, internally in Denmark, I do not think that there has been enough emphasis on protecting Bornholm militarily, because ironically, Gotland in Sweden, Sweden used to be neutral, as we way back in the day, but now it's part of NATO, and before Sweden joined NATO, if Russia should sort of choose which island in the Baltic do we attack, Gotland or Bornholm, it would be much easier for them to attack Gotland, because it wouldn't trigger NATO's Article 5. Now it doesn't matter, including because of President Trump. So the Swedes have been smart. They've been beefing up the military on Gotland. The Danes, not so much, not enough, at least in my mind, which to me makes Bornholm sort of the weakest link in the chain in the Baltic, which makes us much more vulnerable than we should be. So that's my interpretation.
Thank you. So possibly there are still some, lessons to be learned, and maybe fortifications or policies to take into account. Coming back on this very important point about the level of lack of accountability for the rapes that were committed in Bornholm, it's such a prevailing and horrible topic, and obviously we can only unfortunately testify that the level of brutality towards violence, towards women in the contemporary Russian-Ukrainian war only mirrors what was happening before. But it feels like this topic has been completely, if not completely erased, if not completely forgotten, but very much underrepresented. I'm looking, Spartacus, at you, hoping that you can illuminate us on what is the measure of possible in this, because we had a visit from absolutely amazing, heroic Ukrainian women who are the protagonists of the film called Traces. And it's a documentary by Elisa Kovalenko, and it includes characters such as Irina Dolghan. All of the women in the film, contemporary Ukrainians who were raped because they were Ukrainian in the current Russian-Ukrainian war. And when they produced the film, that in a very profound, delicate, very, very sensitive way manages to showcase, their fates evolving from this, and them becoming not victims but survivors of these Russian crimes. They mentioned one interesting thing. They said that they had a presentation in Berlin last year, I think during Berlinale, and they had a number of German women coming to them and saying, We are the daughters of German women who have been raped by the soldiers of the Red Army. And it's a complete taboo. It has been a complete taboo in our society to, to talk about that. And when something is completely silenced, there can't be any level of accountability. There can't be any way of moving forward from it, of growing from it, because there are different ways of justice, and we all understand that not everything, unfortunately, ends in Nuremberg, or not everything ends in the Hague. But if there is silence and not even ability to talk, then it victimizes, the victims even more. So what are some of these topics that are not still being discussed enough, I don't know, in textbooks, or opened up in forums, or assessed, that would bring us closer to more even understanding of the truth of the World War II and the lessons from World War II?
That is a huge topic, of course. But let me start a moment before we arrive at the very difficult topic of sexual violence and gender violence, which is extremely complicated for many reasons. I'll get there in a second. I think what we've been talking about, and what Anton's been talking about, what we've all been talking about to a certain degree, Jan has also mentioned it, Jakob has mentioned it as well, is something that goes in the direction of truth and reconciliation. The South African post-apartheid regime tried, and quite successfully, not finally successfully, but compared to other attempts in this direction, that this was fairly successful. Germany went through it as well in the 1960s, 70s, and then very, very much so in the 1990s, when the generation after the Nazi generation started wondering what the hell happened, and started questioning the narrative that they had been faced with from their parents and grandparents, which really switched it around. And today, we're not perfect in any way, but I would say that Germany is a good example of how you own up to your own mistakes. But there's also the reconciliation part of it, which is very important. And that has not been afforded to the former Soviet states, and it hasn't been carried out because as long as Moscow doesn't join Truth and Reconciliation, we can have no Truth and Reconciliation. It's as simple as that. And of course, you as Ukrainians have suffered under it because there was a part of Western Ukraine that participated in Nazi atrocities. There was a much greater part of Ukraine that participated in fighting the Nazis. But all of that has to come to light. And that kind of brings us to the point of when we're talking about sexual violence. It is the most hidden and taboo part of our memory for a few reasons. One of them being the obvious fact that the shame that is connected to sexual violence in general. It doesn't matter if it's in a war situation or not. This is a difficult crime. It's a crime that creates the victim. It confuses the victim, and the question is who is the victim and who is the perpetrator, which is obvious from maybe a legal and practical and moral perspective, but from a personal perspective, it is not so obvious because we're talking about our lust and personal interaction. I think we all know that. But this creates a problem. This creates a problem compared to other ones. It is very hard for us as historians to dive into this and to get any clear answers, because we're talking about living history that has to be told by the women, mostly women, some men, who suffered the under occupation, under liberation in quotation marks or whatever, and were sexually abused or even raped. And the generation has died away when it comes to World War II. So we're never going to get to the truth. What we've seen in the last 20, 30 years in Germany is a growing attempt, at least, to uncover the truth. But we will never get, there is no absolute truth in historiography, but in this one, it's going to be so far away from what we need. I mean, we can study, and studies that haven't taken place are looking at birth rates, looking at the number of reported crimes, looking at birth rates where there was no father reported, and starting to try to dig backwards and see what was the real scope of this tragedy. What came out during that was, by the way, that the whole idea that the monsters Red Army were sole perpetrators of this is not correct. We found, my colleagues found who were studying this, found that the rate of rape under Western occupation was also significant. It wasn't as bad as the one during the Red Army invasion, but it was definitely there. So I think this is also an area where we get another problem, and that is that without putting on my red socks and becoming too much of a feminist, but we're fighting two things here. We're fighting national historiography on one end, and we're fighting male chauvinism on the other end. There is a resistance by my gender to talk about this fact. So we have really three areas of complexity here that come together. You've got the private factor of shame and embarrassment. We've got the national unwillingness to talk about these topics, and we've got the male unwillingness to talk about these topics. And when they come together, it becomes very, very difficult for us to do our job. What it brings me to, though, is the great admiration for the women who has come forward in Ukraine, because what it teaches us as historians, is that we need journalists to do their job, because if this is not uncovered while it's going on, it is never going to be uncovered, and we cannot put it into the historiographical record. Yeah. So we need that, and great admiration for it. And also, I think, I mean, this is a societal development that goes so deep into what we're dealing with in general that it's very hard as a historian to say, okay, we're going to solve it this way. It needs to be solved, and it needs to also become. And we get kind of like tumbling into other areas here immediately, because you said Hague, right? As long as we do not have a functioning system to actually pursue the laws of wars, and we do not have that at the moment because some people will not participate in it. But as long as the international courts are not functioning and are not in place to pursue these things, well, then we're going to have another problem. How do I know so much about what happened? The German atrocities of World War II, I know them from two sources. The records, because the Germans were unusually good at keeping records of what they did, and the Nuremberg trials. If I did not have those two, I would not know as much as I do. That is how I, as a historian, can really follow it. There is more, of course, but those are the main parts of it. Why is it very difficult for me to do the same for Japan? Well, because the Japanese did not feel the need to keep any records of what they did, and B, the courts, there was a prosecution of it, but the prosecution was much more lax and did not focus on China. It focused mainly on the atrocities against Western people, and therefore I struggle when I try to uncover what happened in the Pacific, while as I don't really have to do that much to uncover what happened in Europe. Even nowadays, what the Russians did, or Russians, sorry, that's not fair. I need to, what the Red Army did, because the Red Army was mostly Ukrainian, actually, if we're talking about the people, led from Kremlin, of course, but still, yeah.
Thank you for adding these, and I think you're very right in terms of how you diagnose these different dimensions, and you're probably right. Again, coming back to there are some books written by women, like Susan Sontag's, regarding the pain of others. There is not enough even women's literature that kind of covers, this painful topic from the past, and only probably just, creating more safe spaces to talk about these, even bits of memory that may be preserved still in family memories, if they were preserved, because it feels like it's this level of crime that is very much silenced, in Ukraine, the horrific Second World War can only be compared, as for you, I think Ukrainian, maybe only to Holodomor, Stalin's man-made famine. And I know that my professor, late Professor James Mays, who was helping to bring the memory of Holodomor to Ukrainians, he said that when he was interviewing Ukrainians who were survivors from the families of Holodomor victims in the United States, having lived in the free society for years and years, they were still afraid to talk about it. So I assume how must be difficult even for the daughters of those who have suffered, years.
Generational trauma.
Transgenerational trauma, exactly. Maybe some final comments, Anton, if you'd like to contribute something on the, on this, the challenge of the inconvenient past topics being still addressed, but being addressed in a kind of in a complete way, because I think second after labeling of the Crimean Tatars, was how much Russian propaganda was spending on labeling Ukrainians as collaborators of the Nazis, even though those cases have been there, of course. But also, kind of reducing what we know about Vlasov's whole army and like the whole other things that they're just missing from the historiography and are not ever discussed. Maybe your point of view, and maybe we could take one or two questions from the audience to end.
I want to add some small, very important detail that Spartacus mentioned about this. For example, Tokyo process was not the same like a Nuremberg process, but even Nuremberg process is not enough, not good enough, because Soviet Union was a part of this process. So we don't know about a lot of crimes, especially crimes from 1939 to 1941, when Nazi and Soviet was allies, real allies. They have cooperation in war battlefield, not only in economics. So it's very important part. And in this context, we should understand that access, extremely important part. Full access of people, not only journalists, is very, very important, but prosecutors, journalists, scientists, because I would like to remind that, for example, we have this situation with Nazi, with German society, with reconciliation situation. It's because it required the total defeat of Nazi Germany, completely occupation of of territory of German, division into several countries, and subsequently many decades of education ongoing, and only after this education, leadership of brilliant intellectuals like Karl Jaspers, only after decades of this process, we find this ongoing apology, only after. So in this case that we have now with Russia, for example, if we don't stop Russia, don't destroy Russia, don't occupy, we can sure that they understand, and world understand level of these crimes. And I don't sure that we have enough evidence. If we don't organize some better trials than Nuremberg was against Russia, I don't sure that we understand holistically the deepness of this problem and deepness of this disaster. Thank you.
Okay. We could take maybe one or two questions from the audience, and thank you for this very important addition that you mentioned. Do we have any questions? No, our speakers have been. Have questions?
Just very short, and to Jakob. Soviet monuments in Denmark. It's not only at Bornholm. We also have one at one of the big cemeteries in Copenhagen. I think it's called near the Grundtvig's Church. How is that used? Because it has been in use today, for example. And it's quite interesting because
The recording has stopped. This
Of course,
meeting is
the
being
Russian
recorded.
ambassador knows this, but that does not stop him from laying a wreath both places, because you can't get enough propaganda out there, as many Russian tricolors out there as possible. So but it is, of course, it is difficult how we deal with these, because if now I called it a monument, but of course it isn't really. It is sort of a grave marker for those buried soldiers. And so if I say now we should eradicate this, then 100 meters away we have all the 55 buried German soldiers, and so do we not? I mean, those were the enemies who occupied us for 5 years. So should we then also have those guys removed? And that, of course, it just goes to show that sometimes it seems so simple, but it isn't. And I think what you suggest about context and contextualizing and explaining, it's so important.
Well, maybe this is on a note that we could conclude, because I think as long as you can, in addition to your efforts of kind of orally helping for people to understand the history, if you put, small little plaque by each of those monuments explaining the context for the occupation, that already serves a purpose. What if someone visits cemetery when you're not there? Just for that.
May I add one thing, because the thing is that is also another important point. Because you are damned if you do and damned if you don't. If for instance, when the ambassador comes there, lays a wreath, if there's a crowd of people booing him, he'll send the pictures back home and say, there you see, the Danes are Nazis. And if we remove the monument, there you see, the Danes are Nazis. and if he is allowed to lay his wreath and the monument stands, then he can say, see, the Danes are so grateful for us for being their liberators, and so it is. You can't do anything. There is no 100% right way here.
Can I add something to that?
I have a recipe for you again, but yes.
Yeah,
please.
no, you go ahead.
No. But, I think, first of all, we should care for the opinion of people we respect, because if you always just look at what Moscow's gonna think, I don't think it's very productive.
True.
But at the same time, people will come or not come regardless, but as long as truth is captured, even by the graves that will not be removed, and there is a context that this is a monument to this person. This is how he behaved. This is how much he drank. This is how many people he, I don't know if you have a proof of it, raped or not raped, or this is how much it has cost the population of Bornholm. So the future generations, because I think it's all about our kids, the kids of theirs. We won't always be there to help explain them, and as long as that thread of memory is lost, it's really difficult to teach a lesson. I think we are here. I'm sorry, but it just came out yesterday. I think this new survey by Latama, which will be discussed probably at the Copenhagen Democracy Summit in 2 days. The new survey of how many people in Europe, in the European Union, are ready to defend their nations. 37%. It's actually only from the Nordics to Ukraine that there is a majority or some higher percentages of the societies that said
Feel the threat.
They feel the threat because they have the threat of memory, and those who have not had the occupation of Bornholm, they may not necessarily even understand what they will be facing. Please.
Yeah, I think first of all, I don't think that discussion with how that memory is going to be handled can be solved without reconciliation. So that at the end of the day is we're always going to, as long as there is a front, there is going to be a fight, and we are in an asymmetrical war. That's what I really wanted to add. I think we should not forget that social media, with the risk of kind of touting my own greatness and banging my own drum, but it's really important to not forget that we have another front in your situation in the war that we are fighting. We are fighting against Russia at the moment. That is the information war that is going on. And therefore, I don't think I think it's a great idea to put up plaques, but it's not going to be enough. I think, and here I appeal to you in the European Union and the Commission, we need to up our game. We need to up our game significantly. We're fighting against an incredible onslaught of Russian trolls, cyber attacks and everything that goes on, and we're not doing much about it. There are a few of us that try, but there's no system for us to cooperate. There is nothing in the European Union. I'm trying right now to build one up, actually. I'm going to start a series called Looking for the Heart of Europe, where I'm going to try to put a light on it. I'm going to try to get other creators and people but it's a really uphill battle. And I think that's where it comes in. That's where we need to go. We need to remember that information is power and information is a weapon, and it's been weaponized for things that are not close to the truth. And we need to use the most modern weapons we have, and that, sure, we need plaques, but more than anything, we need a social media presence that actually shows the world a truer, an image that is closer to the truth. We will never arrive at the truth, and then from there we can go to reconciliation.
Thank you. Thank you all for your extremely important contributions. I think we can really end with again thanking the European Commission for their support and partnership in organizing this event. I do believe Ursula von der Leyen said something like the heart of Europe is now beating in Ukraine. I think we feel this. So thank you again, because historical truth and justice and accountability and then reconciliation are all extremely important for all of us. So thank you for being with us on this Saturday, on this important date. I hope that all of people in the audience have learned much during today's talk. So thank you again, Jakob and Gulnara and Anton, who I think had to check out, maybe had a problem with connection, and Spartacus. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Just 5 minutes we need to prepare, and that's why we have the grand piano. Can you take a picture, please?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Where do you want us?
Yes, possible. Yes,
The